Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my talk. Thank you for coming. Very happy to be here at ECGC this year. My name is Heidi McDonald. I am the Senior Creative Director for an organization called iThrive Games, and I'll explain who that is in just a minute. But today, I am going to be expanding on a talk that I gave at GDC a few weeks ago about empathy in games, and take it a little further with another concept that we've been dealing with in our work, which is kindness. And hopefully our work will resonate with some of you. Technical difficulties already, but that's okay. I will continue to introduce myself. I can't get the slides to you.
Oh, I got it. So what's not looking?
Okay, now it's moving. It wasn't moving.
No, it's not.
Right. Okay, so I used to work in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with Jesse Shell at Shell Games, making transformational games with those folks. I made 9 titles with them as a narrative designer and as a systems and features designer, including games about literacy and drug prevention. And if you ever really want baptism by fire into the games industry, try to make HIV prevention fun. I'm also the author of Digital Love, which is a book about romance and sexuality in games that came out in November. Very proud of that. And I left Shell Games to go work for iThrive because I heard about the work they were doing, and I'm like, yes, I want to go help discover what these people are hoping to discover. And who is iThrive? Well, our mission is empower teens to thrive with great games. And that sounds really huge and nebulous. So a little bit about how we do that. There are a number of different activities that we go through in order to carry that mission forward. We do things like game jams all over the United States. We do think tanks. I fly in people like Raf Koster and James Portnow to help us use real science to develop design resources that then we test out in our game jams. It's pretty cool. These are the things that are specifically my job. Left column are things that I do. Developer outreach and events, helping to produce the design resources about designing games for prosocial outcomes. And so basically I am the game person on a team of Ivy League scientists, and the scientists are doing all the stuff in the other column. And do not worry, Heidi is not in charge of science. You would not want Heidi in charge of science, and that's how you know that our outfit is legit. But the good news is I have some pretty cool, pretty smart friends that help us with the science stuff. Our executive director, Susan Rivers, once led the social and emotional learning lab at Yale University. So we've got some pretty great minds helping us with this stuff. Now, lately in the media, there's been a whole lot of attention paid to character education and curriculum that helps with emotional intelligence because they're said to be 21st century skills. And I personally would like to see a lot more of these kind of skills in the 21st century right now. And something really incredible is happening in our industry right now, and I can say this as someone who is flying all over the United States and meeting developers at these events and game jams that I do. And that is that developers are starting to want something deeper. They want to make deeper experiences for the players. They want to do things that matter, because you know what? Pew pew is fun. Vroom vroom is fun. But we're in a point where you can only take a shooter so far before you have to start asking, you know, what matters behind that? What matters behind that? That's what we're trying to figure out, and we're noticing everywhere we go that this is resonating with developers. We're like, yeah, we want to do stuff that matters, that like touches people here, touches people here, but only with consent. Now, lately, 2 of the concepts that we have been focusing on are empathy and kindness. And as I said, some of the stuff that I'm about to say about empathy, I already said at GDC. So if you saw that talk, I don't know, Brenda Ramirez is in the other room. It'll take about 20 minutes. But what does this mean to game developers, the science? Because you could say to me, hey Heidi, I really want to design empathy games, and I can hand you the top 25 journal articles and research findings in neuroscience and social psychology and say, here, read these. And then you could read them and be really bored and really confused and be like, okay, this is all wonderful stuff, but like, how does it actually translate into what I'm supposed to do as a game developer? And if you're not blinded with science, you're confused. So how do you take it and turn it into anything at all that helps the design process? Here's the process that I came up with. What I do is I have my team of scientists do literature reviews to find out, okay, what does the current science say? And then take the top 25 or so findings, distill it down to the most important 5 pages. Then what I do is I take those 5 pages, I bring in top minds in the games industry, I equip them with that science, and I shut them into a think tank for about 4 days together, where we just kind of think about what does this mean for game design. Like for empathy, we did a big brainstorm. We're like, okay, everybody think about every single game we can possibly remember that we think has something to do with empathy. We list them all down on the wall. And then after that, we argue. And this is the part of the process that's really my favorite. We argue about what games really do and really don't belong there. And after we have a list that everybody feels good about, then we take an even deeper dive and we look at each one of those games for what specifically about this game means that it belongs in this list. Is it a system? Is it a feature? Is it a story? Why is it up here? And what we ended up coming up with was basically a design recipe saying that here is a list of systems, features, and qualities about a game that if they are in your game, we believe, informed by science, experts believe that might be more likely to create empathy in your players. And conversely, here's a list of things that if they're in your game might take away from empathy if you're trying to create that. And so we take that kind of recipe and we put it into a design kit. And it's these design kits that I'm flying all over the United States doing game jams with. That's how we validate whether the resources work. And what I start to see with all of these people using the design resources is where are they getting stuck? What stuff is unclear? So we're constantly iterating on these design resources, and they are free on the internet, online, at our website, iThrivegames.org. We currently have 10 of these design kits for different positive psychology concepts, but today, of course, we're focusing on empathy and kindness. And again, all of this stuff, we are a nonprofit, so all of it is free to the global development community, and we keep updating as we test more. Now, we've been focusing on empathy, and despite a lot of the stuff that you're hearing in the news right now about games causing people to be antisocial or violent, that is just not compatible with what the science is saying. The studies are saying the opposite. The empirical evidence is that video games actually promote empathy, and we can try to break it apart and figure out how to design games from the start using scientific concepts, and we do that. But there are also a crap ton of games that have done this really effectively without the benefit of our information. So we want to go through and figure out what is it about these games that made it work. So I'm constantly interviewing these developers to find out what was your process like. Were you trying to make an empathy game? Was this just the happiest accident ever? Where did you get to a place where you made this incredible game that's resonating with people? And like, I don't know how many of you guys played To the Moon, but I was ugly crying during that game. I mean, like, snot everywhere. It was not attractive, okay? Now, Lucas Pope, who made Papers, Please, did not initially sit down and think to himself, I'm going to make an empathy game now. But that does not mean he didn't do it. And like the way that Papers, Please asks you to weigh the consequences of your actions done to help others at a cost to yourself is an important example of empathy showing up in games. And as you can see, that was he didn't plan it that way. It was a happy accident in his case. And I got to talk with the folks who made Edith Finch, and I asked them the same question. Did you set out to make an empathy game? And that's what Ian Dallas said. It's like, no, man, we just wanted to make a game that resonated with us, that we would want to play. And so Ralph Koster's thoughts about flow were published in Theory of Fun about maybe 15 years ago. And flow is actually a positive psychology concept, just like empathy is. And right now it's being taught in universities all over the world in Game Design 101 classes because it's just good design, right? We don't go around saying, oh, you have to think about flow because it's good for you. No, it's being taught in universities as good design. So Ian Schreiber, who's a notable guy from Rochester Institute of Technology, came to one of our design hives and he said, what if 10 years from now, this stuff that we are doing right now is being taught in Game Design 101 not because it's good for you, but just because it is also good game design. Because you saw the titles that I had up there, there's amazing games, right? So maybe there's something there that means that it's part of good design rather than being good for you, like broccoli or whatever. And just so I can say that I had 3 slides in a row with quotes from cool people named Ian, and set an ECGC record for that, here's one that I was dared to put in by my very favorite Ian. But seriously though, why do we care about these games so much? And so let's take a look. According to Neuroscience, these are the parts of our brain that interpret these things for us. The middle interprets language, signals from what you see and what you remember, and the frontal lobe plays an important part too. Emotions, behavior, judgment, that's the neuroscience. That's where that lives in your brain. Here's the social psychology that accompanies the neuroscience. And those 2 sciences work together to form the human capacity for positive psychology practices like empathy. And they're like actual building blocks that are required for empathy. These are the things that all have to exist for empathy to psychologically take root in your brain. And emotional regulation could refer to managing your rage when you're playing certain games. Or it could be as simple as deciding to be the nice guy or the jerk when you're making dialogue choices, allowing players a wide option of dialogue choices to help them experiment with their emotional regulations. It might help them. And then there's perspective taking, and there are a couple different ways that presents in a game. It can play out in mechanics, like in Brothers, where the camera shifts as you change between characters, and you're literally seeing the world at a different height and in a different way, based on which character you're playing as. It can be both mechanics and story, a case like 1979 Revolution, where you're a photographer who has to survey the scene and decide what's most important to photograph, and within what's most important, what do you focus on in that scene that's most important. Based on the choices that you make, different people are going to want to use that photograph for maybe things that you're not okay with. It's really kind of compelling stuff. And then there are the outright detective games where the progression depends on your finding out different perspectives on the same situation. You've got to interview everybody to find the version of the truth that solves the mystery. Empathic accuracy is about predicting how others are feeling and interpreting those cues correctly. And anyone who knows me and my ridiculous level of fandom for Dragon Age would have expected there to be an Alistair slide somewhere. Yeah, someone's raising their hand, yep, well known. You can make certain decisions that piss off your party members badly enough that they will leave and not come back. So if you leave Loghain alive at the Lance meet, you have to know what that's going to do to Alistair if you've been paying any attention whatsoever to the things that he's saying about Loghain the whole time, and like the history that he has with that other character. Given the level of betrayal that Loghain was responsible for, you can already predict how Alistair's going to feel about that, and that's empathic accuracy. Now, empathic contagion is a little bit more subtle, it's less conscious because there's no higher processing involved from the brain. In the 80s movie Stand By Me, Will Wheaton's character tells a story about a pie eating contest at a county fair that turned into a barfograma because one guy overate and barfed, and seeing that guy barf made that guy barf, made that guy barf, the fat lady barfed in her purse, and so on. It had a ripple effect, it was contagious. Now, Thane dying in Mass Effect 2, it was really sad, it was all the sads, but it was made more sad by a few things that they did here in this scene. The blue hues that you see here in lighting, that is very sad. The facial expressions on the other characters are sad. Dialogue and music in the cutscenes, all sad. These things all work together to help the sad kind of be a little bit contagious. So in Telltale's Game of Thrones series, the second we see Lord Whitehill, we already hate his guts because of how the other characters are reacting to him. And he hasn't even done or even said anything yet, but we know that he's an asshole based on what everybody else is saying about him. So Contagion makes use of using the reactions of other characters to cause the same emotion in players. Perspective engagement can be as simple as giving players options to learn more about a character and their situation, but it can also be teasing them with just enough information that makes them interested to click enough to get the backstory. On Nick Yee's player motivation Profile, I'm 96% motivated by story. So I'm that annoying player who goes through and reads every single book in Skyrim, every single plaque on every single statue. And not all the players will see all the content, but all the content will be seen. And it's these special little touches that will help the players have more meaningful experiences. Concern for others. This is where it gets a little bit trickier. Not this exact example because that's really easy. I want to hug Pikachu too. So there's this whole pyramid of feels thing, and your job as a writer is to get the players to move from the bottom of the pyramid to be invested enough to reach at least the middle, if not the top of this pyramid. Apathy does not care at all. It can turn into pity, which is, dude, sucks to be you, which can turn to feeling sadness for the character and what they're going through. Empathy is feeling what they feel, and compassion and kindness are the actions that result from empathy. And we often see designers and writers mistaking sympathy and empathy. It happens pretty regularly. Those are not the same thing. It's the difference between feeling for someone and feeling with someone. Kind of like laughing at someone versus laughing with them. I'm sorry your son overwrote your game. That must be really frustrating versus, oh yeah, that's harsh. I had someone overwrite an 80-hour Oblivion save one time and I was really pissed off too. Wonder who that was.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, he's busted. There are two types of empathy that work together. There's cognitive empathy that takes perspective, recognizes and interprets the feelings and the situations of other people. And affective empathy is all about your feels, feeling what the other person feels. So it's kind of like your brain and your heart, even though they're really both in your brain. It's feeling what another person feels, but to a lesser degree because you're not them, right? You go from the perception of other people's actions, circumstances, etc., into having thoughts and feelings about this information as you interpret it. The crossover between the two is what we refer to as the empathy power zone, and that empowers you to truly connect with and understand others. Now note that taking action is not required for empathy. You can empathize without taking action. Now one of my colleagues at iThrive, Dr. Kelly Dunlap, came up with this table to help explain what happens when you have too much or too little of either cognitive or affective empathy. And ideally, we want both our cognitive and our affective empathy to be intact. There's Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter understands how others feel, and he uses this information to manipulate them, and he doesn't really care. He only cares how they taste, right? Then there's Cartman, who neither understands nor has the emotional capacity to feel for others at all. There's SpongeBob, who feels for others but has no basic sense of self-awareness whatsoever. And then Malala Yousafzai is a young woman who both understands the suffering of others cognitively, and she has the emotional aptitude to act appropriately. And you know, I thought it was really interesting that Malala was the only actual real person on this slide. That was cool. Now, side note, things that are not required for empathy, trauma. I'm going to say something a little bit controversial right now. There are a lot of games out there right now that think that forcing your players to experience trauma in the name of understanding and awareness is what is going to build empathy. Like if I'm going to make a game about anxiety and I'm going to spread awareness about anxiety, I'm going to force my players to experience an anxiety attack. No. Don't do that. It's not the best strategy because trauma is not one of those 6 psychological building blocks for empathy. It's not something that needs to exist psychologically. So all you're really doing is traumatizing people. And be careful, right? It's an even bigger concern with the more visceral medium of virtual reality. Trauma is a danger, as is emotional overload when you feel too much empathy. So just important to keep that in mind and not damage your players. So making players care. How do we do it? How do we make them care? Environmental storytelling can help the game a lot, so can pacing, just the right audio, just the right voiceover, and other things. But the heavy lifting is on the writers. It's on us, because we're in charge of the world, the story, the characters, the dialogue, bringing all of that to life. And Toya Finley, who's here at ECGC this week, said something that is perfectly suited to this point. The personal is universal, and the universal personal. Now, I mentioned earlier that I cried really hard when I played To the Moon, and that I was I was really bothered by that. I'm like, why did a video game make me cry this hard? So I did some honest processing about why that was, and I started to kind of pick it apart and figure it out. The answer is that it was super, super personal for me. The developers of To the Moon have not outwardly said that it's a game about autism, but it is essentially a game about autism because the character of River has autistic qualities, and Johnny, who takes care of her, he is her caregiver, and you see how frustrating caring for her can be throughout the course of the game, and there are moments when you as a player feel kind of uncomfortable and kind of stressed out because of the, how Johnny has to keep taking care of her. And I have another son that wasn't in any of the slides, and he has autism. And the experience of how hard it can be to be a caregiver for a person of autism, and you have frustrating moments and setbacks, but in the end you wouldn't trade that for anything, that resonated so deeply for me that at the end, when you see River disappearing out of all of those pictures, those moments that you had lived through with them together, that for me, and I teared up at GDC when I said this part, because it just really messed with me, okay? Seeing River disappear out of each of those pictures was like me watching my son disappear out of every family picture that had ever been taken of all of the important moments throughout our whole lives. And so it hit me pretty hard because of my own personal experience with my son with autism. And like, it forced you to think about what your life would look like without that person anymore, knowing that he had once been there. And like, my life might have been easier, but I would lose him. And I cried because that was really personal to me. The personal is universal, and universal is personal. Now, the Texas Association for the Gifted and Talented decided that all possible themes can be considered universally. Essentially fits into these 9 categories right here, and that each one is relatable to every human being on Earth, regardless of culture, location, or other factors, and that everyone has examples of these concepts in their lives. Here we have a list from San Diego State University of themes that are very likely relatable to folks, but can all be filed into these 9 categories, like mothering, for example. Everyone has biologically had a mother. Not everyone has known their mother or been a mother. File that under relationships, and you realize that relationships are something that every human being has had. And different people also might file mothering under a different category depending on their own situation and how they feel about their own mother or being a mother, depending on the situation in the narrative. I might personally file it under change because 3 kids was a whole lot of diaper duty. Now, loss, right? We have all experienced loss. And this doesn't have to be loss of a person. It can be loss of things like your job, or loss of your health or your well-being, loss of a sense of safety. These also count. So tap into your own feelings of memories and, feelings and memories of loss when you are presenting loss. And it is both as simple and as difficult as digging deep into your own experiences and realizing that the personal is universal, and reflect that back outward, what you see there when you look deep inside, whether that's painful or whether that's joyful, because it can also be joyful. And you know what? Other human beings will see themselves in that somehow, and that's what's going to resonate. That was the empathy part of the talk. We've also been focusing on kindness, and this is the new part of the talk, which nobody has seen yet. Now, Peter Capaldi, who was the most recent Doctor Who, said this incredible thing in his final speech that perfectly illustrates one of the challenges of working with kindness in design. Always try to be nice and never fail to be kind. There is a difference between being nice and being kind. It's kind of a tough one to tackle in terms of design because there's nuances, right? Kindness involves action. I can be nice without being kind. Kind is very surface level, it is very agreeable, but it is only surface level. Kindness is compassion and action. One is passive, one is active. And there are 5 steps or key requirements in the mental processes to arrive at kindness. And this flowchart is something that we have in our kindness design kit to demonstrate how these steps interact with each other. First, you have to be aware of someone's position. Then you have to feel their distress and want to help them. And then you have to think, wait, do I have the ability to help? You know, do I have $5 to give to the homeless lady? Do I have extra canned goods to give to the Boy Scout canned good drive? Do you have the capacity? You have to want to do the right thing, and you have to think of being kind as doing the right thing, and you have to be willing to use your abilities and resources to help another person. Now, based on the flow chart that I just shared, empathy is an element of kindness, but kindness is not an element of empathy. Very important distinction. You cannot be kind without having some degree of empathy, but you can be empathetic towards someone without being kind to them, right? Because kindness is the action, and you can be empathetic without there being an action involved. So when the experts dove into how kindness is expressed in game design and systems and mechanics, there was a point where we all just howled until we had tears coming out of our eyes because we realized that Cards Against Humanity is the exact opposite of kindness. And we found that super ironic when one considers all the incredibly great humanitarian things that their company does with its success. So that was just an interesting observation that we had along the way. You know, there are some key elements that you can add to a game to promote kindness. You can have a system of gifting that is not, I'm going to give you 6 cookies and then you're going to marry me. It is more like in Animal Crossing where you have the option to help someone. You don't have to help them, but you can give them something to help them out, just to be nice and to cultivate relationships inside the game. Opportunities to help others, including at a cost to yourself, that again happens in Papers, Please. Samaritan play, like being the healer or the person who buffs everybody and spending your time and energy being a support character in that way. Dialogue options that are kind, thoughtful, and complimentary of others. And NPCs who are kind to the players when they have no reason to be at all. And a really good example of that one is Undertale. Those are some characters that have literally no reason to be nice to your character, but yet they model that, and it's really powerful. Now, aim to make your characters relatable to players, because players will empathize with and want to help great characters. And in games, players may learn that kindness is a great way to solve conflict and make friends. You want to show the consequences of being kind or being unkind, playing out in detail. And in interactive novel or story-driven games like Telltale titles, you can make the choice to say or do something kind or mean, and then experience the consequence of that choice, and just kind of see where that leads. And you get to kind of try on, what did it feel like to be good? What did it feel like to be an asshole? You learn these things as you go along. Now, there are definitely some things that can work against kindness in games. Exclusionary or discriminatory dialogue and themes. Games that always or only reward good behavior and giving no meaningfully kind choices. If it is really, really obvious that the game wants you to do the right thing and they're like underlining it with a yellow highlighter, you don't want to make it so obvious because it's going to bore people and they're going to be like, oh, really? Forced morality play? Really? No, don't do that. Kindness just for the sake of earning points, currency, or a cooler sword. We have a question going right now on our team that we're debating pretty vigorously, and it has to do with what would happen if you had a game that was just quests with no actual rewards attached to it. Would players still want to complete the quests? We don't know. We're going to do a study and try to figure that out because that might be something really interesting. We have found that resource management in and of itself, by itself, is not effective at demonstrating kindness because then it's like you've just got like somebody passing out cookies in a game, and then, you know, while you may think, oh, isn't that nice, I get to pass out cookies, you don't necessarily see the results of that, and it doesn't require any sacrifice on your part. So resource management can be a thing that helps you. You just have to make sure that you add other things to that. Now, there is a kindness scale, and it's important to note that kindness can happen on this scale, and it's important to stop with your kindness before it becomes intrusive or pushy, which exceeds the boundary of self-awareness, and SpongeBob belongs in that slide too, for that reason. And in order to test out the design resources that we developed for kindness, we do a number of different things. And this year we sponsored a diversifier in the Global Game Jam. And our diversifier was design a game showing how kindness could transform the world. We ended up with over 350 game prototypes from around the world, from 52 different countries. It was the most successful sponsored diversifier that the Global Game Jam has ever had. And just to put this in personal context, we did an empathy diversifier 2 years ago. We got 44 prototypes out of that one, and I was really proud of that and really psyched. And I came into this year saying, you know, if I get 60 games this year, that's a good goal. Increase it that much, get 60. I logged in on Monday morning after the Global Game Jam, and I saw this number of countries, this number of kindness games, this number of teams who cared about this stuff. That was overwhelming. That was overwhelming. And you know, we didn't even have the staff to deal with 358 prototypes. We're still crunching through the data and seeing what we do about it. We did an analysis of the 358 prototypes, and we've noticed that roughly half of them paid attention to the design resources and really did try to do it right, and probably the other half looked as though they might have slapped on the diversifier after the fact and like made the game and like, okay, which one fits? And that's okay, but that's still a lot of games, and we're really excited about that. I've also been conducting both kindness and empathy game jams all over the country. Anyone who follows me on Twitter is familiar with my Things Overheard at the Game Jam tweet series that I do when I'm at those things. I just did the Kindness Jam, this is the folks who were at the Kindness Jam last weekend in Rochester, New York, and we have another Empathy Jam coming up next month in Irvine, California, and I'm meeting hundreds of developers all over the country who care about designing for these outcomes. And it's just really super exciting. And I start each jam asking people to spend the first hour in their new teams talking about their answers to these 3 questions. What does kindness look like in your own life? When was the last time that you were kind? When was the last time someone was kind to you? You know, what did they do that was kind? How did that feel? What did it cost them to be kind to you? And did you notice what the cost was to them? And kind of getting them all to start sharing their own experiences of kindness and what that looks like in their life, that tends to take hold among the teams in a way that I haven't observed in other jams, simply because they begin the whole process with a mindset of thinking about what kindness looks like and feels like. These teams are kind to each other while they're making the game. And I've been at so many game jams at this point, and sometimes you go to a game jam and there is team drama at the game jam, and people, you know, when you haven't slept a lot and you got to go to the bathroom and the compiler isn't working correctly, people can get cranky, right? And I've seen that at jams happen, but I've never seen anything like that happen at a kindness jam, because they go into the process thinking about kindness. And so it adds something really special to these jams that we have. Here are some common mistakes that I see designers make when they're trying to design for kindness. You know, like I said, the games where the main character just gives out stuff. We had somebody, I'm just going to have a bazooka that shoots hearts at people. And while that sounds really fun, I don't think that represents true kindness. One of them is nice versus kind, because there are nuances that go along with that, and you really have to kind of think that through and how that's going to look in your mechanics. Overuse of gifting, once again, give me 6 cookies and I will love you forever. That's not true kindness. That's trying to get a reward, and true kindness doesn't seek a reward. Impersonal acts, and by that I mean, is a random act of kindness really kindness? If I'm going to pay your toll, you're the guy behind me in the car at the toll booth, and you know, you might be Warren Buffett, you might have enough money, you might not need me to do that for you. The fact that I don't know you personally and don't know what you need, that's an impersonal act. And so we ask people to think through the whole random acts of kindness question, because we don't know that presenting a random act of kindness in a game represents true kindness. That's another question that we're kind of filtering through right now and trying to test and figure out a little bit more, because I think it's an interesting question. Obvious choices, again, like, Do I save the old ladies or burn the village down? And resource management, again, in and of itself, the entire game is you're a survivor of a plane crash and you have to go around and figure out what each person needs. That's not really kindness at a deeper level, and we try to encourage people to think about it at the deeper level. So the winners of the kindness jams all tend to have these three qualities about them. They have small moments that add up to bigger consequences. And I have something really interesting to say about the small moments and bigger consequences thing. Remember I said I talked to the folks who made Edith Finch. One of the insights that they gave me during the interview was that when they did play testing to find out what was it about the game that resonates most with people in Edith Finch, the players all said that it was the little moments, not the big ones. Like for instance, if you have a memory box and you have to decide what objects to put in the memory box, but deciding that means you also have to decide what to remove from it. And just having to put thought toward what do I keep, what do I throw away, it creates a personal moment for you in that game that you can refer back to. And it's those little moments that people focus on, not so much the big decisions, but the little ones. So we found that pretty interesting. We've seen that to be true with all of the games that have placed at our kindness jams. Also, balancing what you need with what others need is a common theme. And we've seen a couple people who have interpreted the question as a question of self-care, being kind to yourself. And those games have been pretty interesting too. And we're actually going to be doing some testing with one of the self-care games that came out of Jam. And also thinking about the costs of kindness in different situations. I thought that one was really interesting because you had one team say, well, how does the cost of kindness differ if you're an introvert versus an extrovert? Or if you are a young person or whether you are an older person. Depending on where you live, how does that change the cost of kindness to people? We found that to be a pretty compelling question for people to think about as well. So we're just going to continue seeing where this work leads regarding the intersection of science and design. And like Ian Schreiber said, we're convinced that designing for pro-social outcomes isn't just good for you, but also it's just a matter of good design. And we got a promising set of test data on Monday that we're hoping to validate and release, and some super cool stuff coming up that we're about to announce. And so I'll continue to bring what I've learned from our work to conferences like this one and to events that we do around the country. The most rewarding part, again, about all of it is to see the number of developers who care about making meaningful experiences for other people and to hear their personal stories about why games matter to them. Because, again, shooters are fun, racers are fun, but there's a whole new class of developers who want something more. And that is why I do what I do. So remember, the place to download our free design resources is iThrivegames.org. If anyone in here is affiliated with a university or a studio who wants to host one of our empathy or kindness game jams at your university or your studio or another location, and especially if you're able to help pay the cost of doing so, since we're a nonprofit, please hit me up after class. We have several concepts with design resources attached to them, which we want to test. And again, we test that through game jams. So if you go to our website and you look at our resources and you find them helpful, or if you build a game using them, we want to know about your game. We want to follow it, maybe do some tests with it. If you have feedback on these resources, let us know, because the people that we're developing these resources for are generally developers who are like, I want to make games like this, but I don't know where to start. This is a starting place. It's not meant to be prescriptive, okay? We're not going to come out and say, this is the end-all, be-all of making these kinds of games. It's not that. It is stuff that is good for you to think about, just food for thought. And same for the developers who are already out there doing a hell of a job without having looked at our stuff at all. It's just an extra thing in their toolbox that they can look at. And then the folks who are teaching game design classes, who want to do classes about serious games, this is for them as well, and just generally anyone who cares about making these games. So please let us know. there's my contact information, and I wanted to leave some time for questions because there are usually a bunch. Gentleman all the way in the back.
Yeah. So you talked about trauma.
Yes.
Not generating trauma for the user. And then you talked about also how over the middle left lowering really upset about it. So where do you draw the line between just something that's sad and something that might need a little bit of trauma?
That's where you bring in your subject matter experts, your psychologists, and you ask for the psychologist's advice. Like there was a series on Netflix called 13 Reasons Why that was about suicide, and they went into the process and they asked subject matter experts, how should we be handling this stuff? And so the American Psychological Association gave them a list of recommendations of here's what you do, here's what you don't do, here's where those lines are, here's where your safeties live. And the creators of that series chose to ignore they chose to ignore the advice of the American Psychological Association, which led them to release a statement saying, yes, we consulted with them, but here was our advice and here's what they did. So my recommendation on that is to involve subject matter experts in psychology who can very likely tell you where that difference is, and also through play testing. If you have people who are willing to test it for you, recognizing that it might be an upsetting experience. I mean, you might have people who care about what you're trying to say with your game enough that they're gonna want to help you with that. So, yes.
So all the bad press that usually goes around video games, how come we don't know more about this? I've become a bit complex in this conversation. So first time I've ever heard of this. So how do we get this out to
I would love for us to discuss that more, actually. I think that the reason games are getting a bad rap right now is because you have these horrible things happening in the news. And when the unexplainable things happen, people want to try to find a way to explain these unexplainable things. And how many of you folks have found yourself defending your college major or your profession every time there's a school shooting? You know, they blame video games. They blame video games immediately because it's convenient and because it helps them attach some sort of solution to a problem that they maybe aren't ready to face, or they maybe have a different solution for. And plus, negative news tends to get more bounce than positive news does. There are studies on that too. But yeah, we would be more than happy to work with you about getting our message out further. So that's amazing. All right, anybody else? Yes?
So for a lot of games like Undertale or Neuroscience, things like soundtrack and set design play a huge part in improving that emotional response of players. How do you, does your group get into that side of the research, or is it like you design kits at all?
Not yet. It is something that we're looking at. We have information about here are things that you can do with those elements that can promote the concepts, but I don't know that we get as granular. I think we talk a lot about what you can do with narrative and story. I think we talk a lot about what you can do with systems and mechanics, but I think we could probably pay a little bit more attention to what you're talking about, because I think we touch on it, but it's not as present as it arguably should be.
Right, because I mean, in a game like Neuroscience, the soundtrack is not even decipherable language, but for a lot of people coming out of that game, that's what evokes that emotional response.
Yeah, it all works together. Yes?
Yes. I'm curious about the narrative aspects. In the game cams or in your other research, have you found people gravitating towards certain genres or settings as being especially helpful or productive for creating empathetic stories?
Actually, it's interesting you asked that question, because I've noticed it, and this is just nothing that has been scientifically verified by iThrive. This is just my personal observation, having attended a crap ton of game jams over the last year. Death tends to work for empathy, and dogs tend to work for kindness. and wins. Yeah, we've noticed a very large number of games involving dogs for kindness, a very large number of games involving old people for kindness. So apparently people are associating dogs and the elderly with kindness in some way. Yes.
You said yet. I'm very interested in that. About his sound thing, where you guys are going to explore more into that. Do you guys have
We certainly could. We're iterating on our stuff all the time. And if you want to go on our website and take a look at our stuff and give us suggestions of how it can be better, I am more than happy to take it out to the street, test it at the game jams, and see what the people are doing with it. That's how we make it better. That's how we produce things that work.
Here,
Yes, in the back.
What is that?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Could you maybe come a little closer?
I just wanted to mention I saw you see the video and I had to say it's a probably underrated game or underexposed game, I should say. I did like the work with possibly the Saturday behind it, although of course the experiences are highly personal. So feel free to check it out if you have, because it is a very underexposed game.
Yep, I agree.
We are finding that the indie space seems to have a better grasp on these concepts at this point in time than the AAAs. And it's not too difficult to realize why. It's because it doesn't necessarily make large amounts of money, right? And one of the things that we're working on is how do we show people that it's good design and there's a legitimate business case to be made for designing things this way. I have not figured out a good way yet to engage AAA developers, so anyone in here who has ideas about that, please hit me up. Because it feels very much like the indie space is thinking along these lines already, but the AAAs are like, I don't know about this feel-goody stuff. So we'll see how that goes. Yes, in front.
Have you done any tests with other folks who play like toys, Kirby or
I know that there's a researcher at the University of California, Santa Cruz, named Catherine Isbister, who is who's doing research on wearables right now, stuff like that. She's collaborating with the University of London about wearables. There is something that iThrive is about to announce in a few months that goes outside the realm of digital games that we're really excited about that I'm not allowed to talk about, but please stay tuned. Anybody else? Yes, in the back.
You mentioned that we were talking about feel things, trauma, not has. I was curious if you had any findings about guilt.
That's a very good question. I don't know about that yet, but one of the things that I was thinking about when I was coming up with this point about trauma, there is something that by and large the game development community is not aware of, and that is if I am going to do a psychological study that involves human beings, I have to put together a research plan that involves proving to somebody called the Institutional Review Board that the study I'm doing is ethical. And unless I get sign-off from the IRB on my study as, yes, this was done in an ethical way, I can't be published in any reputable journal ever, right, because of that IRB approval. Now, what we have going on in the game development community is you have people going to make a VR game about a man getting an abortion without even thinking about whether that's going to be something that's upsetting or not. And you know what? If I was going to do a psychological study involving Papers, Please, I have an ethical responsibility to return my test subjects to a state of mind that is the same or better than when they came in. So if they come in and then they play Papers, Please for half an hour, then I have to give them a cupcake or let them play with a puppy or something. And then everything is okay, right? And so one of the things that I wish game developers would be paying more attention to right now is this question of the Institutional Review Board and ethics. Because if the game you're making wouldn't pass muster for a human psychological study, then maybe you should rethink it a little bit. It's just a thought, and it's something that's been very much on my mind as VR gets more and more popular, because I think VR is a far more visceral medium that has the potential to be very powerful in a number of ways, but with more power comes more responsibility, and there's more potential for people to be very upset and very traumatized. So I think the guilt question is a valid question, and that's something I can go back and tell my team, oh, somebody had a really interesting question about that.
I just want to follow up on the discussion about violence. I think one of the things that bring that back up is that as industry, we've largely advocated responsibility for the violence that we commit. We've made it guilt-free. And I'm wondering, is there any kind of consequence of that? Genders,
I'm not sure what you're asking, I'm sorry.
There's just follow-up.
Oh, okay.
Rather than just make it feel guilty, because guilt then creates.
I don't know that guilt has to be a thing, because empathy doesn't have to always be sad. I mean, we see it come up looking sad a lot of times, but it can also be really joyful. Like if you see a happy ending of like the two characters who've been trying to get together through the whole game, at the end they're finally together, I'm a big old sap. I'll be the one being like, oh, you know, because it's a joyful thing. It doesn't have to be sad. It is often sad, but it doesn't have to be sad. So people should think a little bit more about that too. Yes? Follow up to the follow-up to follow-up. Okay, sure.
At what point, one theory is that if you play violently, you become done with the violence, it doesn't matter anymore. So at what point does kindness become in person?
Well, first of all, I don't think the science follows the first point you made.
That's a theory.
And yeah, I think there's a lot of people going around right now thinking things that are just not true. And it is just not true that playing violent video games, I would tell everybody to go to the Higher Education Video Games Alliance, the HEVGA website. That is an association of every university all across the world that has a game design program in it. They released an amazing statement after a certain video from the White House came out, all about, you know, here's why video games are terrible. HEVGA had a very well thought out response to that in terms of what the science says. So I would have everybody look that up because it was pretty well thought. Yes?
How do you spell that?
H-E-V as in Victor, G as in George, A. HEVGA.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes? Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. Okay. Wasn't trying to make it awkward, man.
Nah, you're good.
All right. You're good. Anybody else? Yes.
So you mentioned a lot of video games for, you know, forcing, like, bringing out their emotions, like, you know, all that kind of stuff. What are some of the worst, like, mental analysis like that, where they try to, like, bring out their emotion, and then it just falls on?
I'm going to be difficult and refuse to answer your question, but I have a really good reason for not doing that. And that is that every single game that's out there represents many, many hours of blood, sweat, and tears from our fellow developers. Every game that's out there, lots of people put a lot of love into that game to put that game out there in the world. And I am not here to point to a game and say, that one sucks for this reason. That's not how I operate. What I prefer to do is look at the ones that do it well and lift those up. That's just my personal preference of how to operate. So that's why I'm refusing to answer you. Yes?
So I work at a nonprofit, a studio that teaches girls on the autism spectrum how to make video games, and we mentioned that some with autism, and there's some emerging research about VR, stuff like that, we use as successful therapy practice. And so I'm wondering if you guys can dabble in that at all, or if
Well, the thing is, right now, I am the video game person on a team of scientists, and the only problem with that is that I was Jesse Shell's puke tester. When I was at Shell Games, I was identified as the single person in the whole company with the weakest stomach. So every time they would have a new VR product, they were like, if we can get it past her, it's probably okay. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. Just make sure the appointments are before lunch instead of after lunch, and we'll be okay. But being the game person on the team who is really, really, really sickened by VR, that has kind of hampered our ability to explore VR to any level of depth. So that is something we could actually use help with because we have a hole in our team in that regard. But I think that we might have a really interesting conversation about what a game jam might look like in your space. I'd like to see people making games about their experiences that way, relating empathy and kindness, because it could be really powerful. So if you're interested, hit me up. Anybody? Going once, going twice. Done. All right.